You're listening to Talking to Teens, where we speak with leading experts from a variety of disciplines about the art and science of parenting teenagers. I'm your host, Andy Earle. We're here today with Ben Dunks talking about his book, Intimacy, a Guide for Young Men about sex. Ben has been working in dance for 24 years, performing, making, teaching, managing, and exploring everything to do with the creative and moving body. For the past 4 years, he has been interviewing young men and young women about their experiences with sex and everything that they wish they knew. And he's created a very helpful and detailed guide for young men on just about every topic they could possibly want to know when it comes to sex. We're going to talk about why it's so hard to talk about sex and why there is such a lack of good information out there for young men. We'll look at the unique challenges that parents face when trying to discuss sex with our teenagers. We're going to explore these misperceptions about what it means to be a man. And this idea that you just have to kind of already know everything and have everything already figured out, and you can't show any vulnerability or ask questions. We're going to talk about pleasure and how to make sure you're focusing on your partner's pleasure. We're going to look at pleasuring yourself and why that's so important. We're going to talk about when sex begins, when it ends, how do you know when it's over, and what do you need to know about orgasms and how to talk about those. Ben's going to share the 2 most important rules when it comes to sex. And we're going to talk about some sensitive issues like penis size and having sex during periods. We're even going to talk about sex shops and sex toys and what we should teach our teenagers about that. It's going to be a very intimate conversation here on Talking to Teens, and we're really excited to get into it. Ben, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We got quite a topic today. You have a book on intimacy, and really it gets into some pretty intimate topics. Talk to me a little about what inspired this book and why you ended up writing this.
Well, I mean, Intimacy, it's a guide for young men about sex. And I actually started writing another book about 8 years ago, which is called Men and Menopause, which was a guide for us blokes to support our incredible wives and sisters and partners and, colleagues in going through menopause. I kind of got sidetracked because I started to see across media just this epidemic of sexual assault that was happening on our young women from our young men, and kind of pursuing it further. And because in the Men and Menopause book, there was a chapter on intimacy. So when you start to write about intimacy, it takes quite a step to do so. But once you've taken that step, you think, actually, I've got something to offer here and to think about in different ways here. So I was starting to see this epidemic in the media, and I was working with a lot of young people, and they were talking about the young men in their lives who were just had quite a twisted and dangerous view of intimate encounters. And, coming to a lot of media and seeing just a lot of the ubiquity of porn, basically, and teaching these young men essentially all the information that they thought they needed about intimate encounters. And a couple of other things around that. These young men are being shamed for watching porn. They're being shamed for that this is their only information. And we have a deficit model of young people in our society, particularly young men. The snowflake attitude, or they don't work very hard attitude, or it's just a really negative attitude. And particularly with young men, and just this portrayal of all these young men being sexual predators in waiting. And there was nothing there. There was nothing there for them. There was an alternative. I couldn't find anything, particularly the 16 to 22 age bracket, which is what I've written the book for, which is when, they're really starting to explore themselves and their intimate futures. So I thought, actually, I couldn't see anything else in the space. I've been writing about intimacy for Men and Menopause, and I thought, I think I have something to add to this conversation. I'm Australian. I've lived in the UK now for 23 years, but I still bring a very straightforward Australian sensibility to these kinds of conversations and these kinds of topics. And I thought that's what was needed. A very straightforward, quite frank, not embarrassed, not shaming ideas on what the reality of an intimate life could be, should be, how they could go about it. Because the reality is that if porn is the teacher, and then the violence and the assault that they see in porn and those algorithms just take them into some pretty dark places, and that's what they think intimate encounters are, how are we expecting them to do something different if there isn't other information out there for them? They're not going to. So I felt that this was just a different pathway for them to focus on. And the central theme is focusing on your partner and focusing on your partner's pleasure and focusing on supporting your partner's experience within any intimate encounter. And by focusing on your partner's pleasure, you're not going to get into the assault by default that is happening so much in terms of these encounters.
So much of the conversation around sex becomes focused on what not to do, how, hey, oh, really big mistake, or just even how, porn is evil and danger. And we worry about our kids getting into something that they shouldn't be, or getting weird ideas from the internet that maybe if we do have any conversations around sex, it seems like it's really kind of, warnings and negative. And there's really just such a lack of talking about the positive side. How do we really do what you're saying and focus on our partner's pleasure, and how do we actually go about that? There's no really, it's like awkward to talk about. And I think it's very rare to find parents who talk about sex at all with their kids, let alone actually talk about it in a positive way, or, how to have really good sex. And it's kind of, why do you think that is? Or just where do you think that sort of that deficit model comes from? Or
it's such an interesting question, Andy. I think we have this fear that if we describe our intimate encounters as positive and fun, all our 16-year-olds are going to go out, get at it.
Yeah, we don't want to encourage them. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think we encourage them by telling them not to. We've all been teenagers, all us adults have been teenagers. We remember that someone told us not to do it. We go and do it. It's part of the experience of being that age, is you want to push your boundaries. You want to explore the edges of yourself and how you exist within the society within which you sit. And part of that is someone tells you not to do something, then off you go. But if we talk about something positively and we have an open conversation about it, our young people then have the opportunity to they have more information. They can come to better understanding of themselves within that information. And actually they explore their parents as people rather than evil dictators who are telling them, no, you're going to get pregnant, you'll get STDs, your life is going to be horrible. I've read some things online where adults are saying, I hope all teenagers have really bad sexual experiences to begin with so they don't do it. It's like, this is horrible. Yeah, I know, it's horrible to read. So there's this idea of pleasure and this idea of sharing an intimate moment with somebody else, whether it's an intimate moment as we're talking about, whether it's an intimate conversation with your best friend, with your wife, with your parents, they're profoundly important parts of our life. It's who we are with each other and how we talk to each other. It's this intimate conversations and sharing of vulnerability. And to discuss that, particularly for young lads or for older teenage boys, to have conversations with parents where parents are being vulnerable with them. They be vulnerable with their parents. It creates a trust and it creates a conversation pathway, open doors to a whole multitude of other things. And I think sometimes parents think, okay, so I have never had a conversation with my child. I now need to launch right into the massive conversation first time off. They're just going to bounce their child out of that conversation. This is obviously one of your areas of expertise, but just those stepping lightly to begin with into the conversations is important. I've had some parents who've bought my book who are now telling me they're sitting down with their boys and reading it chapter by chapter, which is amazing. Blew my mind. I wasn't expecting people to come back to me and tell me that. And these are people I don't know, just sort of messaging me going, this book has enabled us to find a way in to these conversations. Yeah, I mean, intimacy is such an important part of all of our lives.
I think there's a stereotype. It's like if you see in a movie or on a TV show a parent having a conversation with the teenager about sex, it's kind of always the same thing. Or the kid's like, oh, I don't want to talk about this. Oh, no. And it's like, hey, well, we just got to do it. And, we just got to have this talk. It's important. And like we were talking about warnings, birds and the bees talk, as we say, and like it doesn't really have to be that way. But if we subscribe to that stereotype, or if that's all that we see in the media in terms of parents talking to kids about sex, then that's going to really color, I think, the interactions when we do try to engage in something like that. And how do you think we can kind of break ourselves out of that, or engage in a way where it doesn't feel that way?
Just starting with small conversations, small topics, nothing scary. but you're just touching the edge of it. And it might be that you pick a chapter in the book that's not scary. There are not scary, not suggesting some of the chapters are scary. They're frank, and some of them are more frank than others. And I think some of them can be a little bit more confronting with others, but there's plenty of things in there that they can talk about and they can open a conversation with, even if they don't share the chapter. I mean, it's just discussing if, maybe it's something, what's happened in school, in their life, what's happening with various different things. It's not even talking about intimacy. Sometimes part of those stereotypes is that we're not even allowed to get into conversations about any aspect of our teenagers' lives. It's just slowly breaking down the barriers. It's listening to the answers. It's sometimes our lives can be so busy that we ask a question, but we don't really listen to the answer, or we don't listen to the non-answer. Being present with your young person and listen and respond. And maybe there's stuff, you don't always have to be the wise adult and give them advice. Maybe it's just, you just stand there and you listen, and you don't really say that much. And it's just so they understand that you're someone they can talk to and you're prepared to listen to them, not judge them, not shame them. They've spent so much time in those positions of being judged and shamed in so many different ways. Just listen. And then eventually, you get to more interesting conversations. And they will probably actually start to have these conversations with you if they feel they trust you.
How much do you think parents should share about their own sex life or, current sex life and kind of history of what their experiences were as teenagers? Is that things that maybe is better just kind of not really talking about too much, or that's going to maybe create that reaction from the kid that's like, oh,
I don't want to know. I don't want to know. Don't tell me that. Oh, no, well, I think there are elements of experience that you don't have to go into detail of. I think part of the exclusion that we might have with our teenagers is they forget that we've gone through what they've gone through. And I think, again, it's kind of, I had this experience. You don't need to go through the detail, but it's like you could describe to them moments where you were particularly vulnerable, or moments where you made a mistake, or moments where you felt that you don't have to go into the absolute nitty-gritty of it. That's not necessary. It's about, without kind of going, I've done everything you've done, I know all the answers, here they are. It's just going, well, I had this kind of experience and this is what happened and I felt great about this and this was amazing, or this was a bit scary, or I was silly in doing this, so that they can understand that you're gone through their experiences, but you're not trying to tell them how they should be in them, or what the right answer and they have to make their own mistakes. And this is something that we sometimes forget as parents as well. They have to make their own mistakes, because sometimes I don't think we do allow them to be their own people. We try to shape them. They have to find their way. If they can't make those mistakes and learn from them themselves, then it's a deficit for their own future.
Doesn't it seem like there's this idea, especially among young men, that it's like we can't be awesome at sex and we can't be vulnerable about, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. This is my first time. I'm just trying to figure this out. Help me, understand how to pleasure you better. And, let's talk about what you need and what would be better for you. It's like, I think when we see like the sex scenes on movies and stuff, it's never like that. It's just like, oh, okay, lights out, clothes off, sliding into the covers. And so like, there's never really that kind of communication or vulnerability or something like that. It's like gives us this warped perspective that we need to know exactly what to do and we need to just do it right. And maybe that also goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the porn, and how a big part of watching porn, I think, is trying to learn, what am I supposed to do? How's this supposed to work, so that when I get in that situation, I'll know I can be smooth and I can do it right or something. And then we're kind of getting that information from a little bit of a skewed source.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things, isn't it? You're expected to be all-knowing and all skillful. What have any of us ever done first time round where we're suddenly amazing at, whatever it might be? It's just massively unrealistic. No. But this is that idea of masculinity, where sort of masculinity is presented to teenage boys as control and power is the end game. And whether that's control and power of yourself, or whether that's control and power over others, whether it's your friends or whether it's a potential intimate partner, but control and power is the end game. And any sense of vulnerability or kind of intimacy in those ways is seen as a deficit. And this is kind of part of the narrative they're continuing to be taught, whatever media that they're seeing, whether it's images or films, or it just essentially it's just all around them. So this idea of them being vulnerable, you're fumbling away through your first time. And this is, I think, what sometimes is the catalyst to these assaults, is that they're fumbling their way through their first time. They don't know what they're doing. They're feeling embarrassed about this the partner they're with is not sure what's going on. So rather than saying, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, let's just work this one out between us.
Yeah.
They kind of double down on the power and control. They double down on the idea that they don't want to appear to be vulnerable. And then they sort of go into this memory of the lessons from porn, and then it becomes aggressive, it becomes violent, it becomes all these sorts of things where there's no sense of a partnership, there's no sense of sharing, there's no sense of intimacy, because again, these boys are shamed for showing vulnerability. And this is, it's a conversation that I know you have a lot about boys and masculinity and developing it into men and these elements of their life, but it's impossible to attain situation.
Right. As long as you're trying to live up to that ideal, you're always going to feel inadequate.
Absolutely.
Like you're never good enough or manly enough or smooth enough or whatever it is.
And actually, the Fumble Fest, is actually the beginnings of that learning process.
Yeah.
And the being vulnerable is the beginnings of that learning process, as long as it's safe and it's consensual and it's, there's a shared experience. And you grow from this, but you don't grow from that power and control idea.
This intimacy is the central idea of the book, and how much more intimate is it to actually express your insecurities and vulnerabilities and talk through that with one another than it is to close all that down and pretend you're fine and you're smooth and you know exactly what to do. But for some reason, we don't want to go there.
No, and intimacy isn't just the sexual act. Yeah. It's the conversations. It's being with somebody. It's just being physically with somebody, walking through the town, walking through some woods. It's being vulnerable and sharing parts of yourself that you might not share with others. And there's a reality also here that there's a fear of being burned. There's a fear of they're having a relationship with somebody and then that going sour and that it's suddenly becoming difficult and negative, and that's part of life. That's probably part of the conversations with parents of saying, actually, yes, you're 16, 17, 18, you're in love with somebody, it's wonderful. It might end. Yeah. And if it does end, it might be really painful. But actually, that's also part of life. And that's part of the journey of what we experience with each other and the journey of intimacy, sharing something special with each other. Actually, if it does end and you're feeling bereft and it's difficult, it's also because you've shared these moments and you're mourning the fact that those intimate moments won't be shared with this person again. It's important.
You say in the book that there are two main rules when it comes to sex. What are those?
Consent and safety, basically. And everything else comes from those two. Yeah. Because in writing the book, I worked with an amazing young sex therapist over here who's actually a family friend. She's extraordinary, called Cherish Amber. And she went through the book with a fine-tooth comb, both from her young woman position, but also in terms of the sex therapist position. Yeah. And I've talked through some interesting elements of sexual activities in the book. And she felt that as I was approaching some of these, that I wasn't approaching these saying, I was approaching some of them suggesting the idea that it's not that they were wrong, but they were odd or unusual. And actually, the reality is that everything's possible in a sexual encounter. There are so many different kinks and different ways of engaging with each other in multiple different ways that, there might be half a dozen people in this town over here who really like to do it, but everybody else thinks, well, that's just weird. But it's not for them. And actually, if you're engaging with something and it's safe and it's consensual, other people might find it a bit odd and a bit extreme, but actually, why not? So it's consensual and safe. Everything else is on the table.
How do you think how we convey those, or how do we teach those two concepts to a teenager?
Well, that's a really interesting idea. And also, one of the challenges that we're starting to face is that some of our young people are having what is essentially violent and assaultive sex, but both of those participants don't understand that actually it's assault because porn is teaching them that this is what sex is.
Yeah.
So then, there could be an idea that this female partner, having been assaulted, has actually consented to that, not knowing that she's being assaulted because she thinks that's normal. And this is part of the normative process that we're going through in terms of how porn is teaching our young people what is okay and what isn't. So consent is a really interesting conversation. I've had some really interesting conversations about this in terms of now what the landscape of the world is changing for these young people. Are you enjoying, do you like what you're experiencing? Do you feel threatened by this? Do you feel uncomfortable from this? Do you feel, is there any part of you that's going, I don't want to do this, but I'm not really sure? Then, we know how to keep safe for ourselves.
Yeah.
Do you feel safe? Do you want to have this experience? And having the voice to say no. And for our young men to understand that what that is, and also to understand when people are vulnerable, that they've had a couple of drinks, if they're under the weather, if they're under the weather from alcohol or drugs or anything. This isn't if someone's not in the right state of mind, then they're not in the right state of mind. So it's the responsibility for this as well. I mean, these are becoming part of our narratives in terms of our cultural narratives of seeing these situations. So we know what they are, and our young people know what they are. They will have heard stories from their people at school, or they would have just seen them, or in their media. They know what this is. And it's so it's making the choices that they know are safe and consensual, and understanding that actually if somebody is inebriated and you've gone home with them, actually not ensuring that nothing happens it's a really important kind of action to take as a guy to make sure that this person is safe. And actually sober, intimate relations are far more interesting than inebriated interactions. And I talk a lot in the book about alcohol and drugs and just the knock-ons of this, both in terms of the decisions you make, but also in terms of your performance abilities that are detrimental.
Yes. Well, there's this idea that it's going to make it easier because I'm so nervous and so awkward, and maybe both of our just boundaries will come down a little bit, and we'll be more open, and I can open myself up and be able to relate more or something. And that drugs and alcohol definitely, as a teenager, feel like maybe this will help me kind of get over some of those really hard things or something like that, because intimacy is hard, it's challenging. And I think we see alcohol a lot of times as a crutch or sort of a cheat code or something that can help us achieve that more, but it's just really problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, subverts our inhibitions in that way that we also start to make wrong decisions. So not only is it detrimental to your performance, but in terms of the decisions you make, in terms of safety, the decisions you make in terms of consent, now being in the right decisions or the safest decisions are being inhibited by your state of mind. And we've all been in those positions where our inhibitions have just gone and slammed shut in front of us. And there's a big part of us is going, I wish there was some way I could get past this. But that's that's not the answer. And actually, again, probably starting with those conversations, easy conversations, is how we move into getting past those inhibitions, taking it step by step.
We're here talking about intimacy and sex with Ben Dunks, and we're not done yet. Here's a look at what's coming up in the second half of the show.
We just discussed that we're all very different. And actually, we all see the world in different ways. And if you're going to discuss that with your kids, you could be discussing something that you might have done as a family, gone somewhere or seen a movie or watched something. Discuss your different responses to it.
Yeah.
And this is a similar thing in terms of intimate encounters. But there is a reality that physiologically, males and physiologically females are wired very differently in terms of how intimate encounters happen. And, there's super accelerated to ready in 4 seconds flat for young guys. And it could be 4 seconds flat for a young woman, but it could also be 15 minutes or half an hour or an hour.
Right.
So it's being mindful that these situations change, and being mindful of listening and being attentive and being present in terms of what's happening with your partner and doing what is asked, or just sharing the moment and finding the way through having the best experience for both of you. Because actually yesterday, if you're having an intimate encounter with your girlfriend, then she might have just been with you. I think the conversations around masturbation are that it's a really important thing for young women and young men to do. It's really important to explore yourself. And it's actually really, the conversation I think is also, it's really important to explore masturbation without porn.
Yeah.
And just through the physiological experience of yourself, find what you like and what you don't. Because if you haven't had that exploration, you are at a disadvantage when you are suddenly with somebody else. Not only have you not taken the time to understand how you feel different elements of pleasure for yourself, but that will then mean you won't understand how to then take that same experience of yourself with somebody else. There are a lot of guys for whom partners buying toys makes them feel inadequate. And actually, it should be adding to the possibilities. It's not an inadequacy. It should be actually, we have this, what that we do when we are without toys. And then this is just an additional pleasurable experiences that we can do. And it might be that actually you experiment with them and you go, actually, they're just not for us. Or you might experience one or two and you go, actually, let's get the entire range. And actually, and again, you might be with somebody who says, no, I don't want to touch those stuff. I don't like those battery things. And then somebody else who says, look, opens the cupboard and they've got the gold deluxe editions. So it's, again, everybody changes and it's being open to these changes, but it's also knowing what you like. And actually, they are enhancing the experience as opposed to replacing the experience. And that's just a really important element of that. The sooner they can understand that, the better. It's not a statement of disappointment.
Want to hear the full interview? Sign up for a subscription today. You get access to all the interviews I've conducted, as well as new episodes weeks before the general public. It's completely affordable, and your subscription helps support the work we do here at Talking to Teens. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.